Hi, I'm Jamie Agostino. This is Financial Minds Meet the Experts. On this show, we're joined by financial industry experts to talk about topics, trends, and themes that credit union professionals need to know about. Today on Financial Minds Meet the Experts, we're talking to John Bratsakis, President CEO of the Maryland DC Credit Union Association. John, thank you so much for joining me. Would you mind sharing just a little bit about yourself for our listeners?
Sure. So thanks for having me. It's great to be here. So I've been in credit unions for 34 years now. So kind of started back as a management trainee back in 1988. Worked up to fortunately be a CEO back in the mid late 90s. Then I worked for Baxter Credit Union for 5 years, and I've been at the association for the last 10 and a half. So
All
it's
right.
kind of been a nice evolution for me.
Yeah, you've seen the credit unions from all levels, so this is fantastic.
Yeah, it's been fascinating.
All right, wonderful. So, what challenges are credit unions facing, in Maryland and DC?
Well, I think our credit unions are facing similar things all throughout the country. I think the economy and, coming out of the pandemic red hot, right, as an economy and with folks and everything hitting from inflation to unemployment to all of these regulatory things that are happening, given all of the other things that happened throughout the pandemic, from social unrest to the election, to there's just so many different things hitting all at the same time, and with inflation where it's at, with regulation where it's at, I think credit unions are being hit with um, managing growth, managing interest rate risk, managing consumer demand, managing regulatory concerns on what's going to happen in this raising interest rate environment to credit unions. And for a lot of credit unions, they're looking for balanced growth, which doesn't necessarily happen. I've talked to different credit unions. Some still need deposits, others have plenty of deposits, but they need loans. And um, all of these other things that are happening on top of that add another layer with what's going on with central bank digital currency, what's going on with crypto, what's going on with fintechs, and what's the right fintechs to invest in, and looking for those solutions. So there's just it seems that it's such an accelerated time right now. And the cycle that things are happening are so quick, and credit unions are needing to react so quickly and focus, being able to pivot, um, being I always think of, it's not football season yet, but it will be. But we always had coaches, especially in college, they would tell you, make sure your head's on a swivel. And to me, that's exactly what credit unions are doing. They're having to look everywhere and having to stay focused on so many things all at the same time.
Yeah, you're right. It's definitely becoming very challenging to do that. Um, how is the association, helping these credit unions overcome some of these obstacles?
Well, I think one is it, right. I think the leagues, especially, we have a unique spot where we've got incredible relationships with Congress, with regulators, both local, state, federal. I think there's a lot of that is very helpful. And when I think about what we do, is we've done a lot recently with, for instance, interest rate risk is a concern, for our credit unions. It's out there, but it's not as big of an issue for some. But the new NEV test that credit unions are required to run, for instance, is creating a lot of challenges, for a lot of our credit unions. So we, contacted our regulator. We were able to have a meeting, have all the right folks in the room, but have that dialogue, and putting the policymakers and the policy enforcers, for lack of a better phrase, putting them together so there can be a dialogue, and there can be that give and take of And I think there's a good learning curve that occurs when you have a seat at the table. And I believe that's such a paramount foundational component of what we do as trades is making sure that the credit union voice is always at the table. Um, so what we try to do is host either meetings that are some are public, some aren't. Obviously, we have a CEO roundtable with Director Chopra from the CFPB on Friday. So that's he's been very gracious, meeting with different folks, and we're fortunate he's going to actually come up to the office on Friday, and we're going to have a CEO roundtable, to talk a lot about a lot of the issues. This idea of junk fees, whether it's credit card late fees, overdraft, whatever it may be, those are concerns to credit unions, and they have a really large impact. And I sometimes policymakers and regulators don't have a direct line of sight down to the ground level. That they'll hear one side of things and they don't hear the other side. And that's what we try to do. And we've been fortunate that our credit unions are pretty vocal when there's issues that are affecting their ability to serve their members. And we try to make sure that we get them in front of the right folks to affect change, to make sure, and not in a way that in any way would jeopardize safety and soundness, but in a way that helps explain here's the reality of what's happening on the ground with credit unions, with our members. And it also allows us to demonstrate why credit unions are different.
Wonderful. What other things are you and the association currently focused on?
So the other things that we're working on, education, training are a big piece of what the work that we do. And it's always been one of our foundational pillars that we call it. What the most recent one coming up that we have is our what we call Tech Summit, and we there's a lot of things going on. So we feel it's a great opportunity to bring a lot of folks together, a lot of thought leaders. So there's Mark Seavright, which many people know. We've got Kirsten Wells, who's the principal economist for the Federal Reserve. People from the Clearinghouse, Paul Fiore, who some know, talking about crypto and PSCU, CUNY Mutual Ventures Group. Um, Elizabeth Mikulski is going to speak about. She runs the Discovery Fund for them, which looks to fintechs that are run and owned by underrepresented groups. So that's a another great opportunity. And then we're bringing in 8 fintechs, and they're going to have a competition. So we call it the FinTank. So we make it kind of fun. And the other thing that we're working on is moving some of our training to an online ability. We still have the ability to do in person, and we've been working on a DEI 101 program over the last year with a lot of different partners from AACUC, Humanity, CQ locally, First Financial, IDB Global. They've all been, a huge help for us in developing something that is a self-directed program, introductory program for credit unions. So looking at things, that's what we've been told is a need. So we're focusing on that.
Great, that's wonderful. I'm a big proponent of education. That's one of my favorite things that I'm responsible for at the corporate. So I love all the programs that you guys are doing. I see them, and so I hope the credit unions do participate. And I personally love when you do the FinTank, the competitions. That's my favorite part. You did it at the annual. You
Mhm.
had that discussion, and last year you had a little competition, and I really enjoy that. So one of the key things that I enjoy. So, um, anyway, what other issues are you trying to address with policymakers?
So one of the key pieces that I think we have to continually reinforce to policymakers is that credit unions are different by not our structure makes us different, but it's not just what we do and how we do it, it's the why we do it. And with policymakers, again, it's making sure that they understand that credit unions are solutions to issues. They're not creating these issues. Um, we had a big fight with public funds in 2020, actually. And it was interesting because we had this big discussion, and you could always tell the questions that the bankers will plant with the committees. And the one question that they kept hitting us with is, well, you're not held to CRA. Credit unions don't have to deal with that. And finally, at some point, the conversation gets a little bit more animated, and I just said, well, there's a simple reason for that, because we didn't create CRA. The banking industry brought CRA on their own, on themselves, because of their practices and their actions. Credit unions don't do that, which is why credit unions haven't been included. And the question was, the banking trades were outraged by that, quote unquote. And I said, I'm not disparaging anybody here in Maryland or locally saying that anyone's doing anything, but all you have to do is Google CRA and it'll tell you in 1974 it was created to combat the banking practice of redlining. And it, so reminding, um, I think, our legislators and our regulators and policymakers and decision makers, all the way down to the local level, why credit unions are different, and it's the how we do it.
Mhm.
Whether it's during the pandemic, people providing deferments without question, and stepping forward into the foray, into the challenges people were having with the pandemic instead of being reactionary, being proactive. There's, I think, a list of things that credit unions were doing to try to make people feel better, trying to keep people connected, trying to bring people together. CQ's kindness campaign, NIH had their thank you to first responders. People were putting up, messaging, uh, and just the all of our credit unions. I think in the first 9 months, the first survey we did, it was almost $2 billion in financial relief that credit unions had provided their members. Um, and that wasn't regulated, it wasn't mandated. It was done because it was the right thing to do. But again, they stepped forward, they stepped into it. They didn't step backwards, they didn't wait for it to happen. And I think that's where we need to continually remind those policymakers that credit unions need flexibility. We need to be recognized that, because credit unions grow and are successful, doesn't mean that that changes our mission or our focus. That's who we are, it's what we are, and it's how we do what we do.
Well said. Perfect. I mean that's really sums it up. I mean, credit unions really are different, and we truly care about the communities that we serve. And yeah, you're right. We need to reinforce that with policymakers of why we're different and how we are serving, our members differently. So
One thing that happened during the pandemic that was interesting was with the comptroller's office. Um, during, and especially in 2020, was the first time they were trying to work with CQ, and Dave Swidecker brought it to me, and we got together to talk about. They still wanted to encourage people to shop Maryland, to help small businesses, but to invest locally. And our credit union stepped forward, and they worked together. And there was a whole Shop Maryland initiative where credit unions were, it could be gift cards, it could be double, quadruple reward points if you bought local. So it was, things like that, that that's where the credit union difference of trying to say, how do we encourage people to, stay positive, but also help these small businesses that were struggling, so people weren't just focused on Amazon only.
what is your vision for the Maryland DC Credit Union Association?
So our vision is, from a strategic standpoint, we've always talked about helping credit unions become dominant in the marketplace, right? That's been the association's vision, mission, if you will. But I think really, our vision is to be the premier trade organization for credit unions in the region, and to do things in ways, whether it's when we advocate it, we focus relentlessly. We passed the first credit union act since 1965 in DC during the pandemic, to try to provide an option for credit unions. In Maryland, we were able to work with the administration and our credit unions to during these executive orders to make sure that they were reflective of the reality, but also working with federal regulators, to make sure that the, our credit union's voice was heard at a level, just like we talked earlier about the Roundtable Friday is a good example, and leagues do that all around the country. Um, in our advocacy work that we do from a legislative standpoint, we want to make sure that our credit unions are connected and plugged in from a local point to the highest point federally, to make sure that our component of the 535 seat strategy that we talk about as a league system, and CUNA, and working with NAFCU as well, all of this packaging where the power of these 535 relationships sit within every league. We need to make sure that when something's coming up, when it touches financial services or touches financial literacy, that the first call from our legislators is to our credit unions, is to us, to say, what do our credit unions think? And we're very fortunate, knock on wood, that we get those calls, thankfully. And I know that happens all throughout the country as well.
Well, thank you so much. Any final thoughts or comments for our listeners?
No, I would just say, final thoughts for our listeners. I think just keep doing what you're doing, but what are the needs that you need to help, not just survive, but to succeed and flourish. I think that's where credit unions do our best work. When there's a need, we're there, but still making sure that credit unions are, kind of the financial institution of choice, because we really are the last local community financial institutions left, and it's owned by their community, it's run by their community for their community. So I think I would just tell credit unions to, as challenging as things are, keep doing what you're doing, because that's what makes credit unions different.
All right. Well, John, thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it. And I want to make sure everyone's marking their calendars for the Maryland DC Credit Unions Association's 2022 TechCon. It's August 16th and 17th. It's at the MGM National Harbor. They've got a great lineup of speakers. John's already mentioned several of them, but they also have Rodney Hood from the UNCUA. They've got Chris Odie from CU 2.0. And you can learn more about this event and register for it by visiting their website, mddccua.org. As always, thanks for listening, and I hope you have a wonderful day.